Working in CSS requires us to come to some understanding of what is the box model. Now, the box model is how our web browsers interpret elements on our pages. So everything that is an element that corresponds to the box model, not an inline element, it's going to have width, height, and a content size associated with it. Outside of that will be padding, then we will have a border, and then we have margins. So all of these elements contribute to the overall size of a given element on our page. So we have to take that into account when we are trying to use specific sizes to control the positioning and layout of those elements on our screen. And it often becomes difficult to figure out where those elements exist. And one of the tricks that we've talked about before is to use the red border trick, where you apply a 1-pixel red border to everything on your page so you can start to see where does the web browser think the edges of a given element or item exist on our page, so that we can take control of them. So we can see the element, we can see the spacing around it, the padding, we can see how it got collapsed at the top so it sits against the top of the element. That's one of the things that happens, is we will have collapsing padding, collapsing margins when elements get near each other, so that we have spacing that makes sense. So that if we have then a top margin and a bottom margin on a paragraph, if we put two paragraphs together, we will usually only include one of those measurements between the two elements, so we don't get double spacing between the paragraphs. So it's a convention that is baked into part of the CSS specification to make sense, but oftentimes it screws up the layouts on our screen. In the developer tools inside of Chrome, if we select a particular element, we will see it shows us the box model. So it shows us how big an element is, it shows the padding, it shows the border, it shows margins if they have been applied. So if I go and select in this other paragraph, we can see what's there. We can click on this figure and we can see no margins, 1-pixel border. It has padding applied to the sides. It collapsed it at the bottom. We can find the image. We can find the caption. So for all of these, we can start to see how the different sizing information has been factored into a given element. So the inspection tools inside of Chrome, in our Chrome developer tools, are really useful. So you can go find them by clicking on the three dots that will be on the side of any window when it's open. So I can click on the three blocks and get into my tools. So I can get in the developer tools. Also under edit, I'll see that, or view, I can go to my developer tools and choose my developer tools, and it pops it up. And choosing any element inside our code is going to give us the details of that particular element as it's appearing on screen, as well as the properties that have been associated to it. We can see what CSS is being applied as well. Item we want to look at is box sizing. Box sizing is how we can rectify a lot of the issues that plague CSS layouts, and that's the unpredictability of our margins and padding and how those incorporate themselves into the size of a given object. So I commented out any reference to box sizing in this particular example, and within that we can see how the gradient, which is sitting behind the text, is now intruding into my text proper. So that's problematic, and that's because the sizing that's being applied to this gradient box on the caption is not being sized correctly in relation to the size of the figure, which also has the picture, because we want that caption to be sized to match the picture. When we look at box sizing, we will see that we have certain values that we can assign to it. We have a content box and a border box as we work with it. The default is going to be content box. That's what box sizing has been traditionally. So for many, many years, that was the only option we really had access to. And to counteract that, we would often have to use negative margins, negative padding to control the layout and sizing of elements on screen. And it was a hack. It was ill-advised and usually problematic. Anytime you start doing things and going down that road, it's going to come back and bite you in the butt as your layout becomes more and more complex. By being able to say border box, we now are able to have the width of an object to be set equal to the size of the border plus the padding plus the width of the content, which is different than using content box where the width of the content is the calculated width of the element. And that excludes then border and padding, so we will have lots of problems occurring in our pages. So MDN lists box sizing as experimental technology and says check the compatibility table. If we check out can I use, we will see that it's pretty much green lighted in all of the major browsers and versions of the browsers, meaning we're in pretty good shape if we want to use this. We'll notice that it does not go back for older versions of IE, so that could be problematic, and you would need to look for a polyfill or a hack fix as a way to overcome that. Going back into our project, noticing how the figure caption is wrong. If I reinstitute the border box, immediately my captions have resized themselves to align to the size of the picture because the caption was set to 250 pixels wide, and the pictures that have been brought in have a width of 250 pixels. Because of that, that makes the two line up perfectly so that our caption, which has the blue background on it, is going to then line up with the picture instead of extending beyond the size of the picture. Border box can be such an easy fix to the sizing issues. Some recommendations on using the universal selector and then zeroing out your margin and padding. So this concept of normalizing our document to get it ready for work. We set position relative so objects have position. It's important to set position on something on our page. Normally we do it to the very beginning element, or we do HTML and we set position on that so that when we try to position future elements, they have something to position in relation to, because their positioning of absolute and relative is all based on in relation to the previous position parent. And if nothing has been positioned, we can sometimes have unpredictable results. So one of the recommendations that some people do on their universal opener to their CSS is they put in the box sizing border box at the beginning and say done, and just run with it so that it tries to apply it to everything, and that can clean up a lot of issues without you having to encounter them later on and go, why is this not laying out the way I need it to lay out? To note inside the markup on this particular file is that you will notice that a figure, which is in this case a picture with a caption, so we have an image and a caption inside this figure element. A figure element is designated to be a standalone element that can be the child of an article of a section or of main, but it does not go inside a paragraph. So it's actually against the specification to put a figure block as an element inside our paragraph. We can have an image as an inline element in our paragraph, but figure is a standalone element, not unlike the fact that you wouldn't put a paragraph tag inside a paragraph tag. We don't put the figure tag inside a paragraph tag. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. If you look up the spec on figure, it's very explicit that it should not be contained inside other block level elements like headlines or paragraphs. You're putting together your main page. Make sure you're trying to take advantage of using proper HTML5 tags, minimize your use of divs as presentational elements, try to just have creative selection going on through CSS selectors. So there's a header that has the nav inside of it, main, which then contains the figure and the paragraphs. We get to the end of main, then we can have a footer at the bottom of the page. Putting all of these on screen allows us to then control how the page is going to lay out. We could have a main background occurring behind all of this. We could have different backgrounds occurring behind the header, the footer, and the body or the main section. All of this is contained inside the body, which currently doesn't have any direct styling on it. One of the commented out tags at the moment does set up the body so that it gives it a fixed width simply to demonstrate how this document can then be sized to fit into a smaller window so that it floats as a narrower page. So if you are adhering to a specification that at desktop size you want it to max out at 960, then we can apply that to the body. We could apply other breakpoints through media queries and create a responsive page, and that's something we will look at in the future. Working on your pages, one of the things I do want you to start thinking about is moving outside the proverbial box and getting more creative and interesting with some of your designs. Matt approached with the question of how can I animate different movements or transitions on screen and create that different effects. So we have a color change going on, we have a size change going on. So within the matte file you can see some of that happening. But what's interesting is it creates interactivity, it creates a visual effect, and it's moving beyond just simply boxes. As you think about how are you going to put something on screen and make it interesting and make it engaging, start going down that road. Now, a lot of what is happening here is we have different radii applied to the elements because that page is just simply a bunch of paragraphs. They have classes attached to them to identify them. Then they are colored, where they have a hover state color assigned. The animation is occurring because transition has been applied to the root class of those paragraphs. So when their width changes or their color changes, then that property is animated. It's possible to specify which property you're animating and give it a different time value if you wanted. So you could animate the color faster, the movement slower. But if you just do transition and you say a time and a type of easing, then it will animate any changed properties, numerical properties. Color being done numerical, size is a numerical property. So anytime we have a numerical property, we can animate it with a transition so it will animate it across time instead of instantaneously. If we remove that line of code and go back and watch this page, we can see it's not nearly as exciting to watch when it does the instantaneous color and size change. So it's a much more engaging experience if we have that transition in as part of it. Now, it does suffer from an animation standpoint. When it grows larger, it goes faster because every movement or size change is taking the same amount of time, even though some are only growing 200 pixels and some are growing 400 pixels. So we get a very different feel with the animation. As you plan out animation, as we will incorporate some of that into our designs as we go forward, feel is a tangible part of animation. Looking at the unicorns, keeping in mind that this is done purely through CSS, so we have the subtle change of color. It's been slowed way down as an animated effect. The layout, the circle, the carving of that out, the rounding of the corners, it's all CSS. As you start to plan out how are you going to build the CSS for your projects, I want to see you pushing some of the creativity of how can you create an interesting layout, not just simply put a bunch of boxes on screen. If we turn on the borders, we can see how these different elements are being positioned on screen. So we can see the margins pushing things apart. We can see the padding occurring inside of the elements. We can see the completeness of the elements where this text box is occurring. So all of this is now happening on screen. Having the border makes it possible to better see what is happening.